have lost a lot of sleep back 55, well, 51 or 2 years ago when I had an internship at a DC think tank. And I had to sit in the Library of Congress and study the so-called slave pamphlets that were on microfilm. And Willie Lynch started off with his earliest publication, I think it was 1708, they had in Congress, and he wrote a series of letters that were really printed pamphlets. And he was let's see, in Bermuda. He was a slave owner and raiser of slaves in Bermuda, and he traveled all over the American colonies. It included Bermuda, Barbados, Jamaica, uh, the Bahamas, and what became 13 colonies, and Canada, mostly in the south of what became the U.S., and he taught how to enslave folks. So there were Willie Lynch letters in pamphlets, and there were a whole bunch of them. And for the 150-year period that they stretched over up until basically 1860 or so was the most recent set of slave pamphlets that I had to read and research. They all were consistent. It wasn't just divide and conquer. The secret was that you raised slaves like horses. And I had a ranch out in California where my ex was raising horses, and I had 15, 16 of them around the ranch at any given time. And the way you do that is when you buy wild horses, which you could get cheap, for breeding stock, wild Mustangs, secret, you cannot domesticate a wild stag, but you can domesticate a wild herd mare. So what you did is when you domesticated the females, which was sometimes a struggle, but when you domesticated the females, she would domesticate her offspring for you. So if you had a foal that had a lot going on and you left the foal with the mama, you wouldn't have as much work to do to domesticate that horse as if you wean that foal very early. I'm not it away from its mother. Then you would have a lot more work than you would have if the mama showed offspring the basis. So they relied on the black woman to teach her children how to be good slaves. Now, one of the things that Willie Lynch advocated and was taken up was allow your fresh Negroes to run wild in your district. Watch them carefully. Figure out who the ones were that were going to be the chiefs. Get the leader, get his assistant, pick out which one you want to use to breed with, and then strip the other one naked, torture that one, have him sodomized by a freak in front of all the children and the women and the rest of the slaves. And the slave women would no longer look to their men for protection. So you just killed one of them and used the other one after you crippled him for breeding. And that way you would have the slave women exercise their selfishness to become grandmothers, which seems to have been a thing then. So they would raise their boys and girls to be good slaves so they would survive that long. And that was one of the secrets to slavery. Never deal with a mature or elderly slave male. Always deal with the elderly, mature slave females. Now, where did the men go wrong? Well, you had all of this territory from what was the eastern seaboard all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and a lot of Native Americans out there that black folk could have escaped and allied with, and it would have altered the entire history of the country. Something like what they did down in Florida with the Seminole Indians. you had the five civilized tribes: Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole. And we could have done that, but the black men apparently didn't, not enough of them wanted to be warriors, and then a great deal of the reason why was you didn't catch too many warriors and make slaves out of them, though you did, and they tended to cause a lot of trouble when they got brought over here. Now, the slave trade, in terms of importing slaves, ended, I think it was 1807 by the Constitution. So you've got a problem with how they bred slaves. One of the most insidious things that I read, by the way, was this. Willie Lynch, not so much because it was very early, but later on, the slave masters were instructed to go in with their fellow slave owners and buy a stud. Now, there was a peculiar attribute they wanted this stud to have. They also wanted him to make a good preacher. So make the stud to preacher and allow slave marriage. So the slave male would find out that when his female wife, well, his wife was believed to be in heat, the slave masters would bring over the stud preacher to sleep with his wife, often on his pallet in his hovel. That would do what now would be called demoralizing him. And the slave masters were told to attend the services regularly, not so much to eavesdrop on what the slaves were up to, but to watch this. And this was in those pamphlets over and over. When one of the slave women got happy and got to shouting and rolling on the floor and thrashing around, now they call it getting the spirit, they did then too. That meant that they were coming into Esther, so we're going to be fearful within 3 days, so make sure that the slave preacher would have sex with her so you could increase your livestock and your workforce. So, I mean, it was all kinds of insidious stuff, and that carries over into now. I used to represent the Black Baptist Ministers Alliance, 35 some years ago around here. And I remember attending the seminar they were having on life insurance for the preachers. And this guy was saying that their actuarial table showed that black preachers tended to preach for about 50 years before they retired, assuming good health. So all of a sudden it clicked in my mind. This was back in the 80s. I said, oh man, wow. It's 1860 and they've got a 20-something-year-old black preacher who's a slave preacher. The Civil War had to start. He's been screwing all of the babes in the church, and he's going to preach from 1860 to 1910. When the preacher takes over from him in 1910, assuming one of these old Southern black churches, he's going to do the same thing that his daddy did, in this case, his predecessor. He's going to screw all of the women, and the grandmothers and great-grandmothers of the church are going to be used to it. And this dude is going to be preaching from 1910 to 1960. So in 1980, the preacher did
Wheatley vodka, distilled 10 times.
the preacher that took over in 1960 would still have another 30 years to preach. And he would be in the position of being the grandson, effectively, of the slave preacher. And grandson's doing what dad did, what granddad did, and they screw all the chicks in the church. And when you see you see it once your eyes get open. It's like we know about germs, right?